November 2, 1944, about 900 Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The artillery has finally stopped. For 60 minutes, the sky above the German-Belgian border has been torn apart by thousands of high-explosive shells, a man-made thunder designed to pulverize the enemy defenses waiting in the gloom. Now, a heavy, ringing silence hangs over the tree line, broken only by the snap of burning timber and the shouts of non-commissioned officers. The men of the U.S. 28th Infantry Division rise from their muddy holes. They check their M1 Garands, adjust the straps of their webbing, and look into the dark wall of fir trees ahead. They are cold, they are wet, and they are about to step into a meat grinder. The order is to advance. The objective is a cluster of towns with names that mean nothing to the boys from Pennsylvania: Schmidt, Wassenack, Hürtgen. But the real enemy isn't just the German soldier waiting in his bunker, it is the forest itself. This is the Hürtgenwald, roughly 50 square miles of ancient, rugged woodland, a dense monoculture of fir trees planted so closely together that a man can barely squeeze between the trunks. The trees tower 75 to 100 feet into the gray autumn sky, their interlocking branches forming a canopy that blocks out the sun. At high noon, the floor of the forest is bathed in a perpetual murky twilight. It is a landscape from a Grimm's fairy tale, dark and foreboding, where the ground is a carpet of rotting needles, and the air is thick with the smell of pine and cordite. For the American war machine, which relies on speed, maneuver, and overwhelming air superiority, the Hürtgen is a nightmare. The tanks of the armored divisions are useless here, confined to narrow, muddy logging trails that act as shooting galleries for German anti-tank guns. The Piper Cubs and fighter bombers that rule the skies over France are blinded by the canopy. Pilots cannot see the targets, and forward observers on the ground cannot see the sky. The technological advantages of the United States Army have been nullified by geography. This fight will be decided by the riflemen, at ranges often measured in feet, in a place where the enemy is invisible until the muzzle flashes. The assault on November 2 is not the beginning of the battle, but a desperate escalation of a fight that has already been raging for weeks. The U.S. First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, has been feeding units into this wood since mid-September. The strategic logic is murky. The High Command, focused on the drive to the Rhine and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, views the Hürtgen Forest as a threat to their flank. They worry that German forces could mass in the woods and strike the Americans pushing toward the city of Aachen. There is also the matter of the Roer River dams, massive structures just beyond the forest that hold back millions of tons of water. If the Germans blow the dams, they could flood the plains downstream, washing away the Allied advance. But in the autumn of 1944, the dams are a secondary thought, a hazy objective. The primary goal is simply to kill Germans, to pin them down, to bleed the Wehrmacht dry. But it is the Americans who are bleeding. Before the 28th Division arrived, the old reliables of the 9th Infantry Division tried to crack the forest. On September 14, they pushed across the border near Röttgen. They expected a screening force. Instead, they found the Siegfried Line. The Germans call it the West Wall, a defensive belt of pillboxes, bunkers, and dragon's teeth tank traps that snakes through the forest. The bunkers are masterpieces of engineering, reinforced concrete buried deep in the earth, camouflaged so perfectly that a GI can walk right past one without knowing it is there, until the machine gun opens fire from the rear. The 9th Division fought for weeks in the mud and the rain. They gained about 3,000 yards of ground, less than 2 miles. The cost was 4,500 casualties. That is 1.5 American soldiers killed or wounded for every single yard of ground gained. By late October, the 9th was combat ineffective, their rifle companies gutted, their survivors staring with the 1,000-yard stare of men who have seen too much. They were pulled off the line, and the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division from the Pennsylvania National Guard, was sent in to take their place. Major General Norman Dutch Coda, the commander of the 28th, is a fighter. He made a name for himself on Omaha Beach, rallying troops under fire. But the Hürtgen is not a beach. It is a claustrophobic labyrinth. Koda's orders are to launch a three-pronged attack to seize the town of Schmidt, a crucial road junction on the high ground. To get there, his men must cross the Kaul River Gorge, a steep, rocky ravine that cuts through the forest like a jagged wound. As the 28th steps off on that cold November morning, the German artillery answers. This is the defining horror of the Hürtgen. The tree burst. The German gunners, veterans of the Eastern Front, have fused their 88 mm 105 shells to detonate on contact with the treetops, 70 feet in the air. The explosion sent a rain of jagged steel shrapnel and splintered wood plunging downward. In a normal battle, a foxhole is a sanctuary. In the Hürtgen, a foxhole is an open grave. There is no cover from above. Men are cut down in their holes, shredded by wood and steel raining from the sky. Despite the barrage, the 28th pushes forward. The 112th Infantry Regiment, the main effort, struggles down the slippery slopes of the Kaul Gorge. The trail is a muddy goat path, barely wide enough for a jeep, let alone a Sherman tank. Engineers work frantically to widen the track, blasting rock and shoring up the soft earth, but the ground is treacherous. A single slip sends vehicles tumbling down the ravine into the river below. Miraculously, the lead elements of the 112th make it across. They climb the far side of the gorge, and on November 3 they burst into the town of Schmidt. The German defenders, surprised by the audacity of the attack, are driven out. For a brief moment it looks like a victory. The Americans hold the high ground. They have pierced the forest. But the Germans are not routed. They are merely repositioning. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, is a master of defensive warfare, a fireman sent by Hitler to salvage impossible situations. He sees the American capture of Schmidt not just as a tactical annoyance, but as a dagger pointed at the heart of the Roer River dams. If the Americans hold Schmidt, they control the high ground overlooking the Schwammenau Dam. Model cannot allow this. He orders an immediate, overwhelming counterattack. On the morning of November 4, the mist clinging to the ridges around Schmidt is torn apart by the roar of Maybach engines. The 116th Panzer Division, the Windhund, or Greyhound Division, slams into the exhausted infantrymen of the 112th Regiment. The American GIS in Schmidt are lightly armed, their heavy weapons and armor support still stuck miles behind them, bogged down on the treacherous Kaul trail. They hear the squeal of tank tracks and the terrifying rip of MG-42 machine guns before they see the gray shapes emerging from the tree line. The fight is ferocious but unequal. American bazooka teams scramble to find firing positions, but the German armor, supported by infantry who know every fold of the terrain, rolls over the foxholes. Panic begins to set in. The order to withdraw is given, but in the confusion of the forest, a withdrawal quickly disintegrates into a rout. The Americans stream back toward the village of Kammerschate, desperate to put distance between themselves and the panzers. But the escape route is the trap. The Kaul Trail, that narrow, winding dirt track carved into the side of the gorge, has become a bottleneck of horror. Down in the gorge, the scene is apocalyptic. A single disabled Sherman tank blocks the path, forcing jeeps and weasels, small tracked supply vehicles, to try and squeeze past on the crumbling edge of the ravine. They slip. Men scream as vehicles tumble end over end down the steep slope into the river below. Combat engineers work with frantic energy to clear the blockage, their shovels hitting rock, all while German artillery observers on the surrounding heights rain mortar shells onto the exposed trail. The supply line is severed. The wounded cannot be evacuated. The ammunition cannot be brought forward. The men of the 28th Division are cut off, isolated in pockets, fighting for their lives in a box of pine and stone. For days, the battle rages in the gorge and the surrounding woods. The village of Wassenach, perched on a ridge nearby, becomes a charnel house, changing hands 8 times in a seesaw battle of attrition. By November 8, the situation is untenable. The U.S. High Command orders a full withdrawal from Schmidt and the Kaul Trail. The 28th Infantry Division staggers back to its starting lines, shattered. The cost of those 6 days in November is staggering. The 28th Division suffers 6,184 casualties. The division's insignia is a red keystone, a symbol of Pennsylvania, but after the slaughter in the Hürtgen, the German defenders give it a new, grim nickname, the Bloody Bucket. The division is so mauled that it has to be pulled off the line to rebuild, sent to a quiet sector in the Ardennes, a tragic irony, as they will find themselves directly in the path of the German winter offensive just a month later. But the American command does not stop. The machine demands forward motion. The failure of the 28th is viewed not as a warning about the terrain, but as a failure of aggression. On November 16, as part of a broader offensive named Operation Queen, the U.S. 7th Corps flings fresh units into the Green Hell. This time, it is the 4th Infantry Division, the Ivy Division, that steps into the abyss. Colonel Charles T. Lanham, commanding the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division, is a hard-charging officer, a friend of Ernest Hemingway, and a believer in offensive action. His regiment is assigned to clear a sector of the forest near the Roder Way stream. In a bid to catch the Germans off guard, the attack is launched without a preliminary artillery barrage. The hope is for tactical surprise. It is a miscalculation. The Germans are not surprised, they are entrenched. They have been waiting in this forest for months. They have pre-sighted their mortars on every clearing, every trail junction, every depression in the ground. As the men of the 22nd Regiment step off into the dripping woods, the silence is not one of surprise but of a predator holding its breath. When the firing starts, it is relentless. The 22nd Regiment enters an 18-day ordeal that rivals the worst trench warfare of the First World War. The weather turns against them. Freezing rain turns the forest floor into a slurry of mud and ice. The temperature drops and a new enemy emerges, trench foot. Men stand in water-filled foxholes for days on end, their feet turning white, then blue, then black. The non-combat casualties begin to rival the battle losses. Respiratory diseases and combat fatigue, what they used to call shell shock, drain the manpower of the rifle companies. In the dense undergrowth, the fighting devolves into a series of isolated, vicious brawls. A squad might advance 50 yards, take a German bunker with grenades and flamethrowers, only to be pinned down by a sniper in a tree or a machine gun nest they missed 10 feet away. The casualty rates are unsustainable. Over those 18 days, the 22nd Infantry Regiment suffers 2,773 casualties. That is roughly 85% of the regiment's normal rifle strength. Some companies report loss rates of 151%, meaning they have burned through their entire original roster and half of their replacements in less than 3 weeks. They gain about 6,000 yards of ground, 3.5 miles of shattered trees and mud. Still, the grinding continues. The village of Hürtgen itself, the namesake of this torture chamber, finally falls on November 29 to the 8th Infantry Division, but the victory is hollow. The town is a ruin, the streets choked with rubble and the wreckage of war. By early December, the focus shifts to a conical hill that rises sharply out of the forest floor near the town of Bergstein. Hill 400. To the Germans, it is the Bergberg. It offers a commanding view of the entire area, the only place where an observer can see above the treetops to direct artillery fire with precision. It is the eye of the forest. The task of taking Hill 400 falls to the elite. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, the men who scaled the cliffs of Point du Hoc on D-Day, are brought in. They are shock troops, trained for impossible missions. On December 6, they launch their assault. They do not walk, they sprint. Charging across open ground under withering machine gun fire, the Rangers rely on speed and violence of action. They storm the hill, engaging the defenders of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division in hand-to-hand combat. The Rangers take the hill, but taking it is only half the battle. For the next 24 hours, the Germans throw everything they have at the summit. Artillery barrages pound the rocky peak, shattering the slate and sending deadly splinters of stone flying like shrapnel. The Rangers, huddled in shallow scrapes carved out of the freezing earth, endure a barrage that would break lesser units. They are counterattacked 5 times. Each time, the German infantry climbs the steep slopes, supported by the terrifying crack of high-velocity tank guns firing from the valley floor. And each time, the Rangers, low on ammunition and bleeding from 100 cuts, kick them back down. They hold the Bergberg. They deny the enemy the eyes of the forest. But the cost is absolute. By the time they are relieved, the 2nd Ranger Battalion is a shadow of the force that stormed the beach at Normandy. The capture of Hill 400 is a tactical masterpiece, a feat of individual heroism that stands in stark contrast to the operational paralysis surrounding it. But even this victory highlights the tragic absurdity of the campaign. The Americans have seized the observation post, yet the primary strategic threat, the Roa River dams, remains in German hands. For months, the dams have been the elephant in the room, a looming disaster that the planners at 1st Army Headquarters seemed unable to bring into focus. The Schwammenau and Erft dams hold back millions of tons of water. If the Germans blow the sluice gates, a tidal wave will surge down the Roer Valley, turning the river into an impassable flood plain and trapping any Allied forces that have managed to cross. It is the ultimate defensive weapon, a liquid wall that can wash away an entire Army corps. Yet, for 88 days, the American command has thrown division after division into the wood to seize ground that offers no tactical advantage, ignoring the dams that render that ground meaningless. It is only now in mid-December, after the forest has swallowed the 9th, the 28th, and the 4th Infantry Divisions, that the High Command finally decides the dams must be taken. On December 13, a ground assault is launched to seize them. But the hour is late, and the German hold is ironclad. The enemy knows the value of those dams. They are the lock on the door to the Rhine. The fighting drags on, a slow-motion catastrophe of mud and blood. The weather, already miserable, turns vicious. The temperature plummets and the rain turns to sleet, then snow. The forest floor, churned into a quagmire by months of shelling and tank treads, freezes into a jagged moonscape. For the average GI, the war shrinks to the size of his foxhole. He is wet, he is freezing, and he is sick. The medical clearing stations are overwhelmed not just with shrapnel wounds, but with the rotting feet of men who haven't changed their socks in weeks. Trench foot becomes a plague, claiming over 9,000 non-combat casualties. Men are evacuated with feet swollen to the size of footballs, black with gangrene, their war over without a shot fired. Respiratory diseases sweep through the ranks, fueled by exposure and exhaustion. The forest is killing the Americans even when the Germans hold their fire. Then, on December 16, the strategic calculus changes in a single, violent stroke. The morning begins with a deceptive quiet, the kind of heavy silence that often precedes a storm in the Eifel Mountains. To the south of the Hürtgen, in the thinly held sector of the Ardennes, the sky erupts. The German army, which Allied intelligence had written off as broken and incapable of offensive action, launches the Ardennes offensive, what history will remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The irony is bitter. The entire justification for the Hürtgen campaign, the reason General Courtney Hodges fed 120,000 men into the meat grinder, was to protect the flank of the advance and pin down German forces so they could not counterattack. But the Germans were not pinned. While the Americans were battering themselves senseless against the bunkers of the Siegfried Line in the Hürtgen, the Wehrmacht was quietly massing its armor just a few miles to the south. The Bloody Bucket, the 28th Infantry Division, having been pulled out of the Hürtgen to recover in the quiet sector of the Ardennes, finds itself directly in the path of the German juggernaut. The survivors of the Call Trail are hit again, this time by the full weight of the 5th Panzer Army. The German offensive effectively ends the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. The American attacks stop. The focus shifts instantly from the offensive to desperate defense. Units are stripped from the Hürtgen line and rushed south to plug the gap in the bulge. The dams, the towns, the trails, all the objectives that men died for by the thousands, are suddenly secondary to the survival of the Allied armies in Europe. The forest, having consumed the attention of the First Army for 3 months, is relegated to a holding action. As the guns of the Bulge roar to the south, a silence begins to settle over the Hürtgenwald, allowing the magnitude of the disaster to become clear. The numbers are numbing. In an area of roughly 50 square miles, a patch of ground one could drive across in 20 minutes in peacetime, the United States Army has suffered a catastrophe. The casualty estimates vary, a testament to the chaotic nature of the fighting, but the most reliable figures place American losses between 33,000 and 55,000 men. This includes the killed, the wounded, the missing, the captured, and the thousands incapacitated by the cold. To put this in perspective, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest produced more casualties than the conquest of Sicily. It cost more men than the savage fighting on Guadalcanal. It rivals the losses of the entire Normandy campaign, but without the decisive breakthrough or the liberation of a continent to show for it. The German defenders, too, have bled white, suffering an estimated 28,000 casualties. They have fought with the desperation of men defending their own soil, utilizing the terrain to exact a toll that the American public back home is largely unaware of. The censorship of the era, combined with the overshadowing drama of the Battle of the Bulge, means that for decades, the Hürtgen will remain a forgotten battle, a dark secret kept by the men who survived it. The toll on specific units is horrific. The 22nd Infantry Regiment, which Colonel Lanham led into the woods in November, suffered a casualty rate of nearly 85% of its authorized strength. In the rifle companies, the turnover was often total. A platoon leader might arrive on a Tuesday and be dead or evacuated by Friday. The institutional memory of these units was wiped out. The veterans who knew how to survive the tree bursts and the mines were killed before they could teach the replacements. It was a factory of death that operated with terrifying efficiency. In the aftermath, as the snow covers the broken trees and the frozen bodies that cannot yet be retrieved, the questions begin. They start in the command tents and eventually make their way into the history books. Why? Why did the U.S. Army fight here? General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, a commander who led from the front and knew the sharp end of the spear, later described the entire campaign as a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided altogether. His assessment reflects a bitter truth that settled over the officer corps in the years following the war. The American way of war relied on mobility, overwhelming firepower, and air superiority. By feeding division after division into the dense, dark woods of the Hürtgen, the First Army Command voluntarily surrendered every single one of those advantages. They chose to fight on a battlefield that neutralized their tanks, grounded their aircraft, and absorbed their artillery. To the German commanders, the American persistence was baffling. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, recognized the forest for what it was, a force multiplier for the defense. He knew that a few thousand determined men, dug into the bunkers of the Siegfried Line and supported by pre-sighted artillery, could hold off a force 10 times their size. Generalleutnant Hans Schmidt of the 275th Infantry Division, whose troops bore the brunt of the initial American assaults, later remarked on the sheer waste of it. The Germans expected the Americans to bypass the forest, to encircle it and starve the defenders out, a standard maneuver in mechanized warfare. Instead, the Americans drove straight into the teeth of the defenses, again and again. The tragedy of the strategy is compounded by the objective. The Roer River dams, the Schwammenau and the Erft, were the only targets of true strategic value in the sector. Controlling them meant controlling the water levels of the Roer River, which the Ninth Army needed to cross to reach the Rhine. Yet, for the first 2 months of the battle, the dams were not the primary objective. The focus was on killing Germans and seizing ground, meaningless patches of muddy earth like the village of Schmidt or the tangled ravines of the Call. By the time the High Command realized that the dams were the key to the entire sector, the winter had set in, and the German defenses had hardened into concrete and steel. When the attack on the dams finally began in earnest on December 13, it was too little, too late. 3 days later, the Battle of the Bulge erupted, and the dams were forgotten as the entire Allied line fought for survival. The human cost of this strategic blindness was borne by the riflemen. In the aid stations and field hospitals, doctors began to see a new kind of casualty. It wasn't just the shrapnel wounds or the trench foot. It was the thousand-yard stare. The psychological toll of the Hürtgen was unlike anything else in the European theater. In the hedgerows of Normandy, there was sunlight and the sense of movement. In the Hürtgen, there was only the claustrophobic gloom of the pine forest, the constant dripping of freezing rain, and the terrifying crack of tree bursts. Men who had survived North Africa and Sicily broke down after 3 days in the woods. The constant proximity to death, the inability to see the enemy, and the feeling of being trapped in a dark cage shattered the nerves of even the most hardened veterans. Consider the experience of a replacement soldier arriving in late November. He is 19 years old, fresh from training in the States. He is trucked to the edge of the forest and told to walk up a muddy trail to join his unit, perhaps K Company of the 22nd Infantry. He passes the wreck of a jeep, pushed to the side of the road, and sees the frozen carcass of a mule used to haul supplies. The trees around him are sheared off at the 20-foot mark, looking like broken toothpicks. When he finally finds his foxhole, the sergeant who greets him doesn't know the names of the men in the next hole over, because they arrived yesterday and will likely be dead tomorrow. There is no unit cohesion, no band of brothers, just a collection of shivering strangers waiting for the next mortar round. This replacement might last a week, or he might last an hour. If he is hit, it might take days for the litter bearers to carry him back down the slippery, mined trails to safety. Many wounded men simply froze to death where they fell, their cries for help swallowed by the dense furs. The numbers tell a story of industrial-scale attrition. The 9th Infantry Division, the old Reliables, lost 4,500 men, gaining just 3,000 yards of ground, a cost of 1.5 casualties for every single yard of forest floor. The 4th Infantry Division's 22nd Regiment suffered 2,773 casualties in 18 days, effectively ceasing to exist as a combat-effective unit until it could be completely rebuilt. The 28th Division lost over 6,000 men in a single week. In total, the casualty count for the Hürtgen campaign hovers between 33,000 and 55,000 Americans. To put that in perspective, the United States lost fewer men conquering the island of Saipan. The casualties in the Hürtgen exceeded the total losses of the savage fighting on Guadalcanal by a significant margin. And yet, for all this blood, the battle remains largely a footnote in the popular memory of the war. It lacks the triumphant narrative of D-Day or the desperate heroism of the Battle of the Bulge. There was no liberation of Paris, no raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. There was only the grinding, miserable reality of attrition. The Battle of the Bulge, which started on December 16, effectively erased the Hürtgen from the headlines. The correspondents packed up their typewriters and moved south to cover the dramatic defense of Bastogne and the race of Patton's Third Army. The Hürtgen was left behind, a dark secret buried in the Eifel Mountains. But for the men who fought there, the forest never left them. For decades after the war, veterans of the 4th, the 9th, and the 28th Divisions would speak of the Hürtgen only in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. It was a name that evoked a specific kind of dread, a memory of darkness and pine needles that no amount of time could scrub away. The ordeal of the 4th Infantry Division, specifically the 22nd Infantry Regiment, serves as a grim microcosm of this futility. On November 16, as part of the broader Operation Queen, the IV Division was ordered back into the mall. The plan, conceived by commanders looking at maps in warm chateaus miles to the rear, called for a tactical gamble. Colonel Charles T. Lanham's 22nd Infantry was to attack into the forest without a preliminary artillery barrage. The logic was that the absence of thunder would grant them the element of surprise. It was a gamble that failed catastrophically. The Germans were not asleep. They were entrenched in the Siegfried Line, their machine guns sighted down the fire breaks, their mortars registered on every depression in the ground. When the men of the 22nd stepped off into the gloom near the Roder Way stream, the silence was not broken by the surprise of the enemy, but by the ripping canvas sound of MG-42s. What followed was an 18-day nightmare that defied military logic. The regiment pushed forward, yard by bloody yard, into a dense matrix of barbed wire and bouncing Betty mines. By the time the 22nd Infantry was pulled off the line, the numbers were staggering. In less than 3 weeks, the regiment had suffered 2,773 casualties. To understand the scale of that loss, one must realize that a standard infantry regiment at full strength numbered roughly 3,200 men. The 22nd had effectively been wiped out and reconstituted on the fly. The casualty rate for the rifle companies, the men at the tip of the spear, soared past 151% when replacements were factored in. This constant churning of manpower created a dangerous tactical erosion. In a normal campaign, a unit learns. Veterans teach the new men how to spot a tripwire, how to distinguish the sound of an incoming 88 from an outgoing 105, and which patches of ground offer true cover. But in the Hürtgen, the teachers were dying as fast as the students. A replacement soldier, fresh from the depot, might be trucked to the front at dusk, guided by a runner to a muddy hole in the ground and told to dig in. He wouldn't know the man to his left. He wouldn't know the man to his right. And by dawn, after a night of tree bursts and infiltration by German patrols, he might be dead, his name never truly known to the squad he had technically joined. The institutional memory of the U.S. infantry was bleeding out into the German soil. The village of Hürtgen itself, the namesake of this green hell, became a symbol of the grinding attrition. It was a small cluster of stone houses and a church, insignificant in the grand scope of the war, yet it became a fortress. The U.S. 8th Infantry Division, which had relieved the battered 28th, threw itself against the town in late November. The fighting was house to house, room to room. The Germans had turned cellars into bunkers and attics into sniper nests. The key numbers tell us that the village of Hürtgen changed hands 14 times. 14 times, American GIs swept through the rubble, only to be pushed back by a ferocious counterattack, usually spearheaded by the remnants of German paratrooper units or the stubborn Volksgrenadiers. When the 8th Infantry Division finally secured the ruins on November 29, there was nothing left to liberate. The town was a pulverized heap of masonry, and the cost of its capture was a roster of dead Americans that far exceeded the population of the village they had taken. Throughout this entire period, the leadership of the U.S. First Army, specifically General Courtney Hodges, seemed gripped by a rigid inflexibility. The operational tempo was dictated by lines on a map rather than the reality on the ground. The obsession was with the broad front strategy, keeping the armies moving in unison, protecting flanks and grinding the enemy down. But the Hürtgen was not a place for broad fronts. It was a funnel that negated American strengths. The U.S. Army was built on mobility, mechanized power, and overwhelming artillery. The forest stripped them of the first two and blunted the third. The German commanders, conversely, understood exactly what the forest offered. Field Marshal Walter Model, known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts, used the terrain to masterfully economize his forces. He knew he didn't need to match the Americans man for man. He only needed to hold the road junctions and the high ground. The thick canopy of 75 to 100-foot fir trees acted as a shield against the terrifying American fighter-bombers. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, which ruled the skies over Europe, could not see their targets. They could drop napalm and bombs on the treetops, but the bunkers deep below remained largely untouched. The forest forced the Americans to fight a war of infantry infiltration, a style of warfare that favored the defender, especially one as experienced as the Wehrmacht. And then there was the weather. As November turned to December, the Eifel winter descended with a vengeance. The rain that had turned the trails into glue now froze solid. The ground became as hard as iron, making it impossible to dig new foxholes. Men were forced to occupy the shallow scrapes left by the dead, often finding them half filled with frozen water. Frostbite became as great an enemy as the Germans. The 9th Infantry Division, in the earlier phases, and now the 28th Infantry Division, found themselves thrust into a meat grinder that chewed up regiments with indifferent cruelty. Casualties from exposure soon rivaled those from combat, as the relentless tree bursts and bitter cold decimated the ranks. In this frozen, claustrophobic hell, the war of movement had died, leaving only a brutal struggle for survival. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.